Alright, for today's Industry Insight, we're going to be discussing a topic that I like to call the fast burn syndrome, and how it relates to long-term support and stabilizing yourself in the game industry. Now, this is very similar to a term you've probably have heard before if you follow any creative people, especially any developers, and that is imposter syndrome. What this is the phenomena where someone after a major accomplishment or success can't internalize it. They feel like, I did this, but it was just happenstance. Maybe somebody helped me. Maybe it was just dumb luck. But I'm not really that good enough to succeed this way. And it has stricken a lot of people and has caused depression, especially after a period where you should be happy. And when it comes to keeping yourself in the industry or in any creative industry, it can be tough. And I want to discuss something that I see, especially from indie developers, that have happened over the last decade, and it has actually came close to ruining a few studios, and it has actually closed some studios as well. Now, as we've talked about before, one of the biggest allures of indie development is being able to work on your passion project. That game that you want to make, and damn the consequences. You don't want to hear you can't do this. Nobody's going to tell you you can't. If you want to make this game, you're going to do it, and it doesn't matter if it takes 2 years, 5 years, 15 years, you name it, you want to make it. And this has been the foundation for many independent games, and also a number of big successes. From niche hits like Duskers and Renowned Explorers, to those indie games that have managed to hit things out of the park into the mainstream, like Undertale, Stardew Valley, Five Nights, and probably a lot more we could discuss. And as we've said, once you've had that big success, we could easily actually segue this into the whole popular what is an indie talk, but once you've had that success and you're in the limelight, the pressure is on to keep going. As we've heard before, you're only as successful as your last hit. And this can become a very troublesome development for independent developers, especially when they go from being, this hidden group of people to celebrities in the game industry. And this is where I coined that term, fast burn syndrome, comes into play. It's that feeling that the only thing you can do after your last game is to go big. Bet the farm, double down, go crazy, YOLO it, and more crazy terms like that. And what this means for a lot of developers is trying to push things further. And it can be due to several reasons. The first is the ego. You succeeded doing this one game, so now, I am this great developer, so my next project must be even bigger. But then there's things from the anxiety or worry point of view, that if everyone liked my last game, what am I going to do now? How do I follow up on it? And this can lead to developers really pushing beyond their comfort zone. As we've talked about before, one of the other very interesting aspects of indie game development is because developers are free to work on these games for as long as they want, typically these games are one and done. They are, the full scope of the entire scope and dream that you wanted to make. And after that, the question remains, what do you do next? And this is one of the biggest challenges for independent developers. Because as we've said, if you just spent the last 2, 3+ years on your dream idea, what do you possibly work on next? Can anything compare to that dream project that you just slaved over for so many years? And this can cause a lot of challenge for game developers, especially when you have a developer who gets that, the quote-unquote lotto win, the game that manages to get into the mainstream and blow up, your PUBGs, Undertales, Five Nights, and so on. And while this may sound like a good problem to have, we have seen this come close to wrecking studios, and has wrecked a few studios that I followed in the last few years. Because one of the biggest things you have to understand about game development is that when you switch genres or you do something new, you are essentially starting back at zero again, be it from a programming point of view of having to either design or redo your game engine, and from a design point of view. Just because you've built the best damn platformer doesn't make you an RPG game designer. And in some cases, we've seen developers strike or go out their comfort zone and make surprisingly great games. Hegemon, I know I just completely butchered their name, Hegemon Games, who usually make city builder games, a few years ago they decided to make an ARPG called Victor Vran. And it turned out surprisingly well from a developer who never really did that kind of game before. But for every one of those games that have succeeded, we've seen developers struggle when it comes to what's next, and it can lead to them quickly burning out of the game industry. For instance, the example that I like to go back to is, of course, sadly, Gaslamp Games with Clockwork Empires. After the success of their roguelike dungeon crawler Dungeons of Dreadmore, the team basically decided to go big with Clockwork Empires, stepping out of their comfort zone both in terms of design and in terms of programming, going from making a top-down 2D game to a fully 3D isometric Dwarf Fortress-esque game. And I could probably spend 5 to 10 minutes talking about what I saw there, but we've done that before. The point is, and this is incredibly important to get across for any first-time developers watching, one video game does not make a studio. And while it may seem, and there's two common counters that people will say to that statement, and I want to go over them both right now. The first one is, well, Minecraft and Five Nights and Angry Birds all blew up their respective studios, but it's important to understand something. Those weren't the first games from those companies or from those developers. And we see this a lot in the game industry. And as we've talked about before with how hit-driven it is, a developer who makes a big-name game like the ones we just mentioned didn't just magically appear one day to fame and fortune. It took many prototypes, probably a few or even more failed games, and a lot of time to get that one magic game. But when it comes to covering the game industry, many game journalists and sites will view this as, all of a sudden now blue amazing game that just happened to appear like a meteorite landing on the Earth. And we saw, and it's very funny when I look at indie games that tend to blow up like this. Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, They Are Billions, and even Darkest Dungeon. I remember following these games before they were caught by the big name studios, the big name YouTubers and websites. And it's always funny to me when I see them go, this amazing game just came out of nowhere. And I already covered it like 4 or 5 months ago. But the point is, for the general consumer, they see a game like this, and they just imagine that it just appeared. And that, lightning struck, the planets were on a line, and they were able to succeed. But there's a lot of work that goes into this. We've talked about before with Red Hook Games and The Darkest Dungeon. It was in development for, I think, at least a year and a half, and they spent, I want to say 6 months to a year on the actual Kickstarter before it actually went live. Games like Angry Birds, Rovio has gone the record saying about how long it took him to actually get to that point, and having many failed prototype and lackluster games. I'm sure the same could be said of Scott Cawthon or of Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's fame. Say that 10 times fast. Now, the other defense when I say about one game doesn't make a studio is, of course, Dwarf Fortress. Dwarf Fortress, I think for a lot of people, is held as the poster child of game development. Probably up there with Stardew Valley, possibly at this point. But for the few of you watching this who somehow know who I am and have not heard of Dwarf Fortress has been in development for, I think now, I want to say at least 12, 13 years. Again, for those of you who've been following the game, you know the exact date. It's been developed by two brothers as their dream game. Again, going back to the allure of indie game development. And the game has certainly taken off with funding being done thanks to people donating and just wanting to see this game go. And the developer has been on record saying that the game's going to be finished when they're entirely done with that game. They don't care how long it takes. And I think he said that if it takes another 10 years to finish, he's going to keep working on it because that's their passion. And as we've said before, passion can be very blinding when it comes to any creative endeavor. And the reason why Dwarf Fortress is not an example or not a defense of what I just said is that you do not want to run a business on Dwarf Fortress's financial model. Again, they're receiving money from donations by fans. This is not a guaranteed income. And they've also talked about, from what I've heard, about living on the light end of things. They're not exactly, living on private islands making Dwarf Fortress. But the point is, keeping a studio going takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of managing the budget. And also means understanding the difference between what you want to do and what you can feasibly do. And an example of this I want to talk about is Arcan Games. We've talked about them before, but the studio has been going for over a decade now. And they, of course, struck gold with AI Wars. It has been their best-selling game. But following that success, they ran into that issue of what to do next. And the games they've put out after that, while they've had some niche success, none of them have came close to paying the bills like AI Wars did. And Chris Park has gone on record several times stating that if AI Wars wasn't the success that it was, that company will have gone under many times over. And that is very sad to think, because when it comes to working in the independent industry, one failure, especially if it's a big name or a big project, can easily wreck a studio. If you want to know more, or if you want to hear from another developer who's had to work like that, or has been working in terms of that balance, you can look up the interviews and the presentation Jake Burgett of Grayling Games did. We've spoken to him several times already, and hopefully we'll talk to him again in the future. But Grayling Games has been going on now for definitely, over 14 years at this point, maybe a little less than that. And they have not had that smash hit. They've had some good successes like Regency Solitaire and what I like with Shadowhand. But in terms of those games making anywhere near the amount of money like Minecraft or Five Nights, it hasn't happened. But the studio has managed to stay afloat regardless of that. And it's been due to a combination of managing or being able to understand scope management, and of course working on games that are going to bring money in. And I remember seeing some tweets by Jake after Shadowhand's success, and there was a period where he was really worried how they were going to pay things or keep going forward. But the game has earned enough money for them to keep going. And that can be a very scary prospect. Because again, one big failure can easily wreck a studio. And this is all the more so when you're trying to go big after your success. And speaking of success, we've even seen this on the Kickstarter side of things, where a game that had a modest goal or a modest budget, goes viral and earns, 3, 5, or 10 times the amount of money they originally projected. And then the question becomes, what do you do from there? And it can be very hard to keep projects under scope, and again, to balance what you can do with what you want to do. And this is a very tough topic to talk about, because again, nobody wants to talk about failure, especially when it comes to covering big name games. But we're going to wrap things up here. So to summarize, what I like to call the fast burn syndrome is that inclination to try and go big after either a modest or big success in the game industry. Or more importantly, what happens after you've made your dream game. One of the things that we've seen, and this is one of the reasons why I like to talk about this, is that for many indie developers who strike it big with one game, sometimes we don't hear from them anymore after that success. Or we may hear like a few years later that they were, snatched up or went to work for another studio. But again, it's very hard to keep yourself going, especially in an industry that thrives on creativity. When you put your heart and soul into your dream project, what do you do next? Or what do you even do after that? Most developers aren't thinking 5 to 10 years down the line, let alone, 1 to 2. For those of you watching this, especially if you are a developer, how do you keep yourself going? And what did you do after your first game or your first notable game? Because again, you can make all the games you want in your spare time, but nobody's going to give you the time of day until you've had that breakout hit. So how do you keep yourself going? And how do you manage to stave off the temptation to YOLO it after your first game? Let me know in the comments below, but thanks for watching today's video. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future video, please let me know. Well, otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and see you all next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. If you'd like to suggest games for me to cover or topics to talk about, let me know in the comments below. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on design, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the Game Wisdom Patreon, you can find us on there on patreon.com/gwbeiser. $1 will get you into our private Discord channel where we talk game topics and more. $5 will get you voting privileges for any major event, including the Saturday Night Grab Bag, Patreon-funded goals, and more. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoy more videos here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel.